Good morning, everyone. Welcome to those who've joined us online. This is an open briefing covering off a review of our major events fund policy from 2022. So this is an update from staff in regards to the review that has been done of this policy. So we'll look forward to that. I'll hand it over to Chris Pavan, our Group Manager of Strategy and Growth, and the rest of the team to take us through this briefing. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you. So today is really a check-in to update you on our first phase of work, which has included interviews with a series of key stakeholders and parties, and our sort of initial assessment from engaging with other districts and getting just some broad feedback around the policy itself. One of the things that I wanted to point out, which I think is a little different in terms of our review of the major events fund policy this time, is that we have added in a degree of independence, really. So today you've got Hamish, obviously our Policy and Research Manager, and Nicole Davey, who is also in Strategy Growth, who has supported that independent interview process. The Economic Development team has obviously been engaged through the process, and we've also had policy support from the team, which Hamish is going to share with you. But essentially, really just letting you know where we've got to and where to next as we, I think, step quite quickly through to the outcome of the review. So we will be presenting and taking questions.
So just clarity, are you okay with questions during your presentation, or do you want to wait till the end?
At the end?
Yeah.
Or during?
Yes, it's on the hub. Yep.
So kia ora koutou, everybody. And as Chris alluded to, I'm just going to take you through a little bit of the review process we've been helping lead. I guess the start of that was late last year. I believe we provided some information just as we were initiating the start of the review. It was provided to you via email, and I'm just going to start off today providing a little bit of that context, just about a little bit of what the fund is and background for those who aren't so familiar with it. And some of the process around that. And one of the challenges in particular has been at the end of the year, start of the year, working through and having availability with people, but we'll talk to some of that as I go through. So to start with, a little bit about the background information for the policy is that the policy was first established back in 2016, so a few years ago now, and that was an outcome of the then 2015-2018 Economic Development Strategy. And it was introduced as a key component to support major events for the council, and some of those objectives being sought through the Economic Development Strategy around that thriving, vibrant and diverse economy. As Chris mentioned, it was last reviewed in 2022, where there were some small changes, and I'll touch on those, but one of the main ones was just to reflect the then changes that had come through the recently adopted Economic Development Strategy. So quite often the review of the policy has followed that Economic Development Strategy to maintain its kind of alignment and integration with its focuses. And the key objective of the fund itself is to support a small number of the signature events that can deliver those economic benefits, and also support the district's economic development strategy and some of our destination objectives as well. So that's reflected into our current objectives for the policy, and just to note, it is to contribute to the economic development, and it's focusing around that increasing visitation and spend to the district, so bringing people in, contributing to that vibrant community and attracting people here who come and have something to do in the districts, and encouraging that supportive environment for events to actually come forward and contribute to these overall objectives is a key part of the fund as well. And then the last one is a focus to actually encourage the celebration of the culture, environment and identity of the coast as part of that process as well. So those are some of the key things the objectives sought from the policy to focus on, and obviously to get the message out there about Kapiti and all that it has to offer. So the fund itself, a bit more of the metrics. Currently, the fund allocates up to $200,000 per annum, and that's for Tier 1 and 2 events. But within that $200,000 funding appropriation, we also have $50,000 agreed to look at strategic growth events, and I'll touch on the difference there in a minute. I guess the key thing for those Tier 1 events, just to understand the difference in the nature of those events that we're looking at and supporting, is the Tier 1 events are quite large with more than 10,000 attendees. That Tier 2 is between 2,000 and 10,000 attendees, so that kind of middle ground. And the strategic growth events are often ones that are starting out with the potential to grow, and so those are the ones that are looking at under 2,000 attendees. And the key thing about that strategic growth event, just to note the last review, one of the key changes was to increase the funding to support the potential to grow events in our district. So that's been a key focus. Another focus of the fund is that events can be multi-year funding for up to 3 years to support some of the ability for them to take place over those environments and provide some consistency. And just to note, I guess as part of this review process, because this is ongoing, we're looking at the policy. The current application round for events for the next financial year is currently underway. And that's due to take place. Applications are currently being called for potential events for the next year, and those decisions will be made leading up to the end of the financial year this year. And the idea is that this policy will be reviewed and updated and come into play for the next round. So as well as those high-level objectives for the fund, we have a number of eligibility criteria that relate back to those tiers and who can actually apply for this thing and kind of where the thresholds are. One of the key ones, of course, is where the actual fund comes from, is that it needs to align with our economic development strategy objectives, what we're trying to achieve, and our destination management plan, which actually zeroes in a lot more about what we're trying to achieve about Kapiti and our tourism focuses and efforts. That's distinguished. A couple of the criteria relating to those tiered events that I talked about is those high-level ones about the 10,000 visitors. There's a requirement for those events to be successful for supporting funding to require a 10-to-1 minimum return on investment for those large size, and also to kind of reinforce that role of events to attract people into the district. There's a 30% attendance from outside the district. Those are some criteria that go with those highest level events in the hierarchy. The next level down, the Tier 2, is slightly smaller, appreciating that they are the kind of the middle term kind of entry, where we're looking at a 5-to-1 return on investment with 20% attendance from outside the district. And again, just reflecting some of the differences between those nature events, the top tier, we're looking to bring people in to stay the night from outside the district, whereas that middle tier is about to attract visitors in for the day from elsewhere in the district. So really focusing on Kapiti. But that gives you a flavour for that nature and scale of how big and what the focuses of some of these events might be. And of course, all of them reflect the need to kind of like generate media profile and to portray, you know, the attributes that Kapiti has to offer positively. Another key element of the eligibility criteria is that all events must be run by legal entities, so not individual people. So just ensuring that they have the legal provisions to support the events and what that looks like and how the funding's provided to support those events. And the last one, I guess, in there is that there is a preference in the current policy to be supporting events that have the potential to be self-sustaining in the future. So in particular, that's a component of that growth that I'll touch on in a minute, the Tier 3, where some smaller funds might come through and the ability for them to kind of get a foothold and kind of grow and continue to thrive in the district. So just to give you a bit of a flavour, many of you will be very familiar with some of these events. A lot of them are very successful and become part of our annual calendar for Kapiti. And I guess some of the key ones in there, we've got up there, there's 8 events, including the most recent Otaki Kite Festival, the Māori Land Film Festival as well, and the Kapiti Food Fair, which is some of our high level events with the highest level of attractors from internationally in some cases, but also throughout the region to the local events that are hosted. We've got some of the other events in there around the marathons and other exterior events that are also reasonably familiar And then also just to highlight the Tier 3 Funding Growth Fund is the Kapiti Women's Triathlon is one that falls into that category. So that's a smaller nature event that's been looking to kind of increase and grow its footprint in the district. So one of the things I just wanted to highlight is coming back to that criteria about the return on investment, about that 10 to 1, 5 to 1, depending on where this sits. Looking across all these 8 projects here, the return on investment is averaged to be 20 to 1. So at the moment, the inputs that is provided through the fund is getting a very good return on investment. So that 10 to 5 is the kind of thresholds, and we're up in that 20 to 1 averaged across the projects. Particularly as some of them grow and take place over multiple years. Of course, those offerings are growing and are attracting further individuals and attractions to the district. So that's a little bit of a background, and as we move into the scope of this policy review, as I mentioned before, the policy is usually looked at following the review of the economic development strategy, which is currently underway. And so one of the things we've been looking at is whether it still remains fit for purpose. So looking at some of those criteria, how the policy's been applied, the fund, under the policy's been applied. Looking at how it aligns still with best practice that's out there, and I'll touch on that in a minute. And our Kapiti destination story as well, which was recently updated just kind of to show where we're aiming and looking to move towards. And then identify any recommended changes and improvements. And as part of that, as Chris alluded to earlier, we've done a desktop review where we've been looking at a range of what other councils have been doing, and also the stakeholder interviews that we've been conducting as well to get an understanding of what the experience has been like from multiple perspectives. So just to provide a bit of context about what other councils do, it is very varied. And I guess the most councils, in looking collectively at how they support funding and events for the community, is quite widely done by most councils throughout the country, but there is a marked difference in how they undertake that. A lot of that varies by how large the council is and whether it focuses down at the community level and the scale and nature of those events. With many kind of, in parts of the regions, have a regional tourism entity that also helps support that on behalf of those councils as well. So for us, for instance, we've got the Wellington NZ that we work with closely regionally, as well as our offering locally. One of the key things is that many focus on the economic development side of things, particularly for larger councils out there when they're looking at major events and the funding they provide. But a lot of the smaller councils who also do support are more focused on that social and kind of community cultural elements as well. So, but I think it's fair to say that those are inherently linked with a lot of those economic-driven objectives for some of those larger councils too. Again, just reflecting kind of broadly across what we've looked at for councils, a number of the city councils tend to have larger budgets and functions dedicated towards those major events. So just some of the kind of budgets that are available out there, we've just identified Tauranga. Their fund on website identifies $400,000 annually, and Hamilton $500,000. But also just the nature of some of the smaller funds, like Horowhenua just beside us, they have a $50,000 budget focusing on this as well. So it does vary across the country depending on their priorities and focuses, but there is a range that's out there as well. And I guess just to also note alongside that, there has been decisions made through the last long-term planning fund for a couple of these funds to actually just be paused, or where they've been subscribed not to renew those subscriptions just under the current pressures some of them face. Some councils also, just alongside what they fund to go with it, some of them provide much stronger in-house events funding support and in-kind support. So sometimes that's offset with the amount of money and funding they provide. So, and I guess lastly there, the most interesting thing is about how they actually have application rounds for their funds. So we have an annual fund with one round of funding at the moment, and if that doesn't actually take place, there's provision in the policy for a subsequent round to use to allocate any remaining funding. But again, other councils vary widely between they have that one a year, up to some having 2 to 3 to even quarterly or just live processes where they assess applications. The other, I guess, key distinction for some other areas is that where they do have a live process, they might have an expression of interest, so they have a gateway process for people to come in before they then go through to then be assessed for funds. So there's a wide variety of how different funds approach event funding. Just give you a bit of a flavour of who we've spoken to for those stakeholder engagements, is that a number of the successful applicants and some of those event organisers and various sporting and cultural events we've chatted with. We've had two panel members that we've had discussions with just to understand experiences and processes with the fund. And we've also talked to a number of local and regional representatives from the Events Tourism. So that includes the local economic development, Kotahitanga Board, Wellington NZ, as I mentioned, the regional offering that they provide, which is a common arrangement around the other regions in New Zealand as well, and the Kapiti Business Chamber. And just to note that giving that availability and spanning over that holiday period, we've completed most of the interviews, but we've just got one remaining with the chair of the Tourism Board to go with that as well. So to give you a flavour for some of the initial findings and insights from those very valuable discussions and understanding the current environment, there's been a number that have come out that I'm just going to touch on today. I guess the first one is the increasing costs event organisers are facing in the current environment to actually deliver their events. As we know more broadly, the wider market and environment costs have gone up incrementally over the last few years, and that's no surprise that that's actually coming through to these events organisations. So it's an increasing pressure being faced and something that needs to be balanced in making events actually being able to be break even and occur. So one of the other things is that obviously the funding available then doesn't go quite as far as it does with your costs going up, and the fundings remain consistent. So that's a key thing we're hearing. In particular, one of the key challenges we've heard is the costs of doing business, as it were, for events, particularly with traffic management, came up as a reasonably consistent cost that obviously is a key kind of element for some of these events to be dealing with and providing for the nature of traffic management and people control that a number of them are associated with. Another kind of finding or insight that came through was the ability to support or provide a bit further wraparound business development around some of those strategic growth fund. As I mentioned, we've got one on there, the Women's Triathlon. But some of the feedback that we had is that there's also a number of potentially new embryonic or unsuccessful applications that might come through from time to time. And so just recognising that those events that are a bit more mature and have a head of steam behind them, with no processes and familiarity with them, it's a bit different for someone who's new and coming across the process for the first time. So recognising that and thinking about how do we support some of these potentially new and innovative different events through the process was something that was flagged as well. And one of the other things, just recognising while we do have that return on investment measures at the moment, there's some feedback about sometimes the value and the depth of kind of the contributions to the district and some of those objectives aren't fully captured and reflected and just, attendance numbers. And so maybe looking at kind of how else could we kind of capture and reflect that. System and process improvements, we had a lot of feedback just around the actual experiences with making applications and the processes for going through that, and how challenging that can be. Again, coming back to those who might have prior experience, reoccurring challenges, but then also for new people looking to actually enter into a potential fund application for the first time. And then similarly, we had some feedback as well about some of the challenges and the reality about some of the nature and scale of these events, about how often the events need to liaise with different branches and components of councils with getting their events through. So just a few that jump to mind is obviously about some of the resource consenting functions, also potentially alcohol related processes as well if those are involved with events. And so just the assistance and the ability to navigate across some of those functions was identified. And lastly, as part of all events that are provided, there's a requirement for us to obviously capture and understand the value add from council's contribution towards those events. And we did have some feedback about the kind of application and rigour around some of those reporting requirements from some seem quite onerous for what we're after for the nature and type of investment that we were making. So those are just a kind of a brief summary of some of the highlights. Moving to the next steps, as I previously mentioned, the current fund is underway. and this review work we're looking to continue, and it'll be completed in the very near future to inform the future fund. But a couple of things that we've identified that we need to do further work, but looking to kind of bring through as part of this review, is whether there's any kind of feasible process improvements we can introduce from what we've heard and our understanding analysis we can do to support the funding round this year in the short term. But definitely we'll be looking to analyse findings more deeply, the processes in place and what that looks like for next year as an absolute given. We're looking to also kind of have a look at the processes on the face of the policy, how clearly it's communicated what we're trying to achieve. That includes some of those linkages to ensure it reflects and updates the upcoming work around the refreshed economic development strategy and the Kapiti destination story. But also looking to learn about how we're using and administering other funds across council and any lessons learned we can bring in good practices to kind of support some of those challenges we heard about the unders and overs of making an application process. One of the other things we're quite keen to kind of further understand is the ability to align the MEF policy with the new economic development operating model. So as EDKB comes into its new role and its function, is what does that look like, and how can that sit around and potentially support the purpose and function of the policy and its objectives to deliver on that economic development. And the last one is also we want to further delve into some of those links around those processes and challenges that people find when they come into whether it's council directly or some of the long-term settings. So some of those might relate to the public places bylaw that I mentioned there. They have interfaces with temporary events and public trading places requirements. So keen to understand what those look like and how we can identify potential opportunities to look at them more closely as part of the Public Places Bylaw review, which is due to start in 2026. So there might be some opportunities in there we can look at. And also another area we want to look at is just that alignment and linkage to the district plan as well, because there are some linkages with how temporary events are managed and controlled through that as well. So that's a big area we want to look at and understand to see whether there's any opportunities to come back to you on to discuss further. So that's really the wrap from me, and just to kind of close with what Chris mentioned, this is the initial findings and initial areas we've identifying, and so next steps are for us to work through those in more detail and bring the findings back to you. I guess at a high level, we haven't necessarily seen anything at this level or heard focus around the policy itself. It's actually been more around some of the settings and the processes supporting the policy and its implementation. But we'll look to bring the wider findings and that kind of more detailed analysis back to you in the near future. So happy to pause there and take questions.
Great, thanks Hamish. We've got half an hour, so there's plenty of room here for some discussions and some off-topic meanderings. Councillor Wilson. Councillor Coe first up.
Don't make him grumpy. Right.
Councillor Coe.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, guys. I did participate. I think somebody talked to me about this because I'm on the panel for it, and I did share some thoughts. I haven't sort of seen those surface in any way yet, so I thought maybe I'll just. There's a couple of things that I just wanted to highlight, and definitely the system side of it is a big issue. Having been involved in other grant-making processes, and I think the staff are aware of this, the system is clunky in terms of how it operates. But I think there's some other important issues, and one for me is whether we should be funding long-term businesses that are running events to make profit. I think if a profit-making business is putting on events, there should be a limit to how much funding or how long we continue to fund them, and if it needs to go any longer because they can't make a profit out of it, then I think it should be set up as a charitable trust, so that we're not continuing to fund something where money is going into somebody's pockets. To me, that's just not right. So I think that really needs to be looked at I mean, a lot of these events that we're funding are set up on a not-for-profit basis. There's probably only one or two that are done for profit, but I think we need some clear guidelines on, if someone's planning to run something to make a profit in the medium to long term, we need to treat that differently than we would treat something like the Otaki Kite Festival, for example, that is running on a not-for-profit basis. Because we shouldn't be using ratepayer money to line business people's pockets. So that's a biggie for me. The other one is, I think there's scope there for council to put out expressions of interest, to say, okay, we want to run an event in this kind of area because it fits with our strategy, our tourism, our destination plan, whatever. So we might say, okay, we want to run an event that has a particular theme that fits. Let's put out expressions of interest to the public and see if anybody's out there who would like to have a go at running that and to take it over as a long-term event. And again, that would be, the requirement for that would be that it would be set up on a not-for-profit kind of basis. Because I think the other advantage with a not-for-profit thing is that you end up with say with a trust or an incorporated society or something where you've got a governance board around it that is looking at it from a community perspective. Whereas, if you're giving money to a business, that could be just one person to set up a company. So although we say we're not lending to individuals, any individual can just set up a company and say, well, actually, I've got something that meets your requirements, but you're still only giving money to one person. So I think having some governance around these events with a community perspective is a really good idea. And I think we should really be encouraging the recipients of these funds to be structured in that way as not-for-profits as opposed to profit-making entities, just so that it has that kind of oversight from a community perspective. Not saying that we wouldn't fund businesses, but I think we need to be really strict on the criteria if we are doing that, as I've said. But I think there are some events that we could probably think of now that would, I'd certainly like to see a wellbeing event run in Kapiti. That fits with our destination marketing plan. Why not put some expressions of interest out there to see who wants to run a wellbeing event and sort of do it from the ground up. So I'm not saying that all of our funding would be prescribed like that, but there should be some of it that goes towards events that are kind of prescribed by council. Yeah, those are probably the big things for me, I think, at this stage.
Okay, thank you, Liz, for those comments. Councillor Halliday.
Yeah, great presentation, and the fund itself's doing what it's meant to do. But I do agree with Liz with regards to and just also general thought is we've looked at a certain style of event, which has been great. But I do wonder if it's time to be looking at some other things as well now that we've got the economic development strategy in place. So what I'm referring to is that I noticed one of the key words here, increasing visitor spending in the district. I get one-off events, don't get me wrong, but I would prefer to see some thoughts into some things like trails or other things that actually are repetitive through the year, if you like. And I really like Liz's idea around expressions of interest with regards to building something like that. And I look at our arts trail. We get that one hit in the weekend, but we've got the third largest collection of artists, in the country. So I'd prefer to see, some money put towards the building, the ability for that to be a weekend thing. In other words, if people from outside the area looking at coming to the district, we've got our arts trail. And all the businesses in there are benefiting from that. There's the attraction of people coming to the area. There might be other trails that can be developed as well. I was just playing with an idea of the business associations getting together and having a 5-week cycle of a week's promotion in their specific areas. Now, they'd have to put a proposal to council as such, but it's a bit of a different approach that we're actually getting, because I'm a firm believer, especially since we lack accommodation, is that we should be looking at things to attract people on a regular basis up. In other words, they can come and have a look at this weekend, this next weekend, this the other weekend, and we've got good access from Wellington to be able to encourage that. And I would think that in the short term, so the next 3 or 4 years, that would be an area that could be easily expanded on because of Transmission Gully. The transport issues have now been removed, and that was a big block with regards to potentially through the congestion aspects of things. I'd love to see some exploration of that as a concept because it's all sitting there at the moment. We just need to package it up as such. Yeah, that was about it for me. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, that was my own friend. You know, take on board what Liz was saying. You know, people are trying to get these things up and running. Oh, sorry. The other thing I was thinking, I know there's been a couple of larger events that have had issue with regards to what happens if we're rained out or something goes wrong. And I wonder, I'm not saying underwrite an event, but having the ability to help someone cover costs if beyond their control something's happened for that event to work at a loss, say for argument's sake, that we could potentially help bridge that gap so that the continuation of the event in the future is plausible. Or if people are looking at trying something, that worry that you have with regards to whether circumstances beyond your control mean you are personally out of pocket. It could be your house on the line. It could be all sorts of things on the line with regards to personal. I think now one could argue, yes, there could be insurance in relation to all that, but it's just something I don't know whether it's a possibility at all, but maybe some consideration around something like that as well as part of the equation.
Fantastic. Chris got a comment to that.
Thank you. I think what I can hear coming from the floor so far is that there's an opportunity for us to consider the eligibility criteria that is set in the policy and also the scope that is set for the policy currently. We have noted down some comments and as you would expect, we would come back with some options on that basis, but would also work through what impact we think it would have for the fund itself. And I think perhaps also give you some examples where there have been some challenges and how we have supported entities. And sometimes it's actually a non-monetary support that's been useful. So that in-kind support space, maybe sharing some things around that with you. Just because I'm mindful that currently the policy is very focused on ensuring that return on investment and I guess that's, I'm going to say bluntly, that bang for buck in terms of the investment that council is making to bring people to Kapiti to get the benefits for our community has been front of mind. So we will have a look at those things and attempt to share the impact of changing some of those settings.
Great, thank you. Just noting, Huruwai, I see your hand online for your question, so you'll be up next after Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, a couple of questions about return on investment. So tier 1 is to generate a 10-to-1 return on council's investment. So how's that determined? What's the criteria for what 10-to-1 of what? What are the measures?
Sorry, I'm just looking. Bronte or Darren are just going to pop to the table.
Hello there. So what we do is we ask the event organisers to measure the success of the event via a visitor survey. That survey collects data around how much was spent during the time at the event, how long they stayed in Kapiti for, what other services they used, what other things they did whilst they were here, amongst other bits of information. And that gets correlated with either actuals or estimated visitor numbers. And we use an event model in Infometrics to calculate the economic impact of the event. And that spits out an ROI, but also a direct impact value and a few other figures.
So can I just test? Infometrics provides that service/model/tool to others. It's not a Kapiti district specific tool.
Yeah, that's right.
You got a follow up, Councillor Wilson, Nigel.
Yeah, so the other criteria for those events is that 30% of their 30% of their attendees will be from outside Kapiti. And so again, it's how do we determine that? And I think that's interesting. The Otaki Kite Festival, for instance, which is in that category, I think, of where, you know, it'd be tier 1 in terms of the numbers attending. But I'm not sure how that's being judged. And ditto for the tier 2, where there's a 5-to-1 ratio is expected. But the other concern for me is that one of the criteria is that 30% of those who attend these events are from outside Kapiti, and also a criteria is for them to stay overnight. So to be tier 1, you want them to stay overnight. So that would be, say, as a minimum, 3,000 people expected to stay overnight if you fit in that criteria. And of course, we wouldn't even have 10% of that availability in terms of accommodation. So I'm just wondering if that criteria is realistic. Because if we set criteria and say you're expected to meet these criteria for this funding, except this one just can't happen. It's just not real. We don't have enough motel space for you to meet that criteria for them to stay overnight.
I'm just going to say that's an absolutely valid point to put on the table and concern. I think I just want to clarify that the tier 1, I'm going to call it category, I think the intention was that it was the kind of event where people could stay overnight. Essentially, it's not possible to do that for the amount of people you're talking about, and that's very true. And so that is not what we're measuring at the moment because we can't. But something like the Otaki Kite Festival, as you know, a huge amount of people are coming in. They're spending money around our district as a result of coming through, and that's part of the calculation of the benefits or estimated benefit. I feel, Bronte, you were going to add something. So if okay, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Chris. So in terms of understanding where they're from, that is also part of the visitor survey. We have a target number of visitor survey results we would like to receive in order to model what the entire attendance would be, because sometimes we don't capture that information. It's a little bit more difficult with free events where it's not ticketed and someone's not made a purchase, and we've not captured their data to be able to send them a survey, so we were reliant on people volunteering to participate in the survey. So it's a little bit trickier with the free events. And with in the criteria, we do want an event to attract people to stay a night. Lots of people, like there's an event on this week in the Kapiti Classic. People come up and stay with friends and family from out of the region as well. So the accommodation thing is an issue, but it does still occur. It does still happen for our events. And like you say, we do still have tier 1 events, the food fair, Otaki Kite Festival, but also the Māoridland Film Festival, which is a huge attendance from not only nationally but internationally.
I was just going to say, in terms of the ability to show events that do attract people to stay overnight, that helps us to build a case for outside investors to say, we need a hotel, we need investment in accommodation, because we have these events which bring people, not only nationally, but also internationally as well, sort of thing. And the ability to actually sort of team up that actually supports each other.
I think it's true to say currently we miss out on a lot of events because we don't have sufficient accommodation. So yeah, I see what you mean with that. To take Liz's point, of the 8 that are listed here, six of the 8 are businesses. They are for-profit businesses. And so the criteria for those businesses is obviously to maximise the profit of the event and to keep the event going, etc. And I wonder, because Bronte mentioned the Kapiti Classic, which is on this weekend. Now, the vast majority of those ticket sales are that they're ticket sales. So people have purchased those tickets. So is there any issue around getting that data from the organisers? Are they going to go, no, this is private data, which so we're asking for data sharing. So I just wondered about that. And then I've got one other question.
Just waiting for Bronte's microphone, please.
Thank you. It is part of the grant agreement that they sign that they are to collect and report on the those information, pieces of information that we ask for in the visitor survey. So they own that survey process, and then they feed us the results. So, and the privacy doesn't come into an issue when they are doing it and supplying the results to us.
And my last question is just around, I can remember in the first year that I was here where a grant from the Pickle Pot people was turned down because they were a not-for-profit, because they weren't intending to make a profit. And so they didn't meet the criteria. So to Liz's point, I'm assuming that's changed now, that your motivation doesn't necessarily have to be for profit. And will that fit in to under the strategic growth category, where I think they weren't intending it to be on a massive scale, but it had the potential to grow, and could have grown quite significantly, but it actually died. So I'm just wondering, does this new criteria enable those kind of events?
Look, I think in the past we've always had that difficulty in terms of what's a major event and what's a community event. And a big reason for that change last time was to provide the opportunity to support community or smaller events that had the potential to grow and attract visitors to do that. I think it just comes down to making sure as part of that process we understand what is the motivation for that event going forward. Sometimes it may be just to stay, and it's not a bad thing to be a community event, but we are looking for events that bring in external visitors and those sorts of things. And so there would always be a preference for those ones that actually bring in external parties and have the potential to do that going forward.
I might just add to that to say, I think when we bring the policy back to you, again about the eligibility criteria, just really unpacking the strategic growth area in testing that, how it's been used and the options that could be considered, whether we're happy with the current, I'll call it calibration of our settings. So I see Hamish writing some things down. So when we come back to you, we will make sure that we can come back and have responded to that question.
I just want to, and by the way, descriptors of the events, given that the analysis is technical, the descriptors of an event being a fun, indulgent, and taste, it's really quite floral, the language about the event, as opposed to just what the event is. I'm sure it is, and if it's a fabulous, they're not really technical terms, are they? And so they're very emotive terms about what they actually mean. And if you're trying to establish a set of criteria, how fabulous is it? If that's one of the criteria, it's fine.
I would say that statement is straight off the marketing brochure, wouldn't it be, Mr. Councillor Wilson? That's where I'd read it from anyway. Councillor Pravanov.
Yes,
I'm sorry, I'm just.
Oh, you
I
go
did
online.
say
Yeah.
Huruwai, but he
Yeah, no,
he
he-
dropped into a tunnel.
Oh, did he?
And he'll be back in about 5 minutes. So you get you
Okay.
get priority,
Okay, so
Councillor Pravanov.
it's been a very interesting conversation, and I suppose when you look at the groups that have been funded in the past, they tend to be quite a few outdoor ones, but I'm just looking at potentially, particularly using the Chamber of Commerce or some of our business organisations to see whether or not, for example, we could set up something like the Wellington on a Plate. And so it's a case of where it's supporting the overall coordination of it as a seeding opportunity. And so you could actually tie that in with the food side, the drink side of it. And so I've actually looked online, and so it's not only about going to restaurants, but it's about having, basically cooking experiences. Like Ruth Pritter used to do that, but she's obviously not available as well. So it's actually looking at the whole food, maybe table to the plate as well. So I'm just putting that as an idea out there.
Absolutely. Bronte wants to respond. She was quick to flick her light on.
We do participate as a region in the Wellington on a Plate Food Festival. Last year we had, I think, 4 events. What you're talking about, Apostle Hot Sauce did a DIY hot sauce event, which sold out. I think all of the events bar one sold out. And we support local restaurants between 4 and 6. It's changed. This will be the 3rd year we've done it. A Kapiti tasting safari event. So we lead that, and now the businesses are taking a bit more ownership in that. So that we're definitely involved with regional opportunities like the franchise that is Wellington on the Plate. It's kind of separate to the major event fund through a different support model.
So that's great to hear, and I do know that it is part of the Wellington on a Plate. So I think that's run in August. But I'm just thinking about having our own event up here. So obviously there are some of those businesses who are part of it and actually doing it here to encourage people to come up here. And obviously that's one event, but and there's plenty of other times during the year in which we could potentially look at doing something or having, setting up the system so that something like that could run here as well.
Well, I'll say thank you. We'll note that down and come back to you separately outside of the Major Events Fund.
Yeah.
On perhaps some options.
Yeah, because I know there's the Kapiti Food Fair, and I think there's room. There's room. Thank you.
Probably sits outside of this particular purview of this policy in terms of some other economic development work, I would suggest, but that staff will come back to you on that one. Noted. Let's go online. Huruwai is back into signal range. Welcome your question, Huruwai. Kia ora.
Oh, sure. Just checking, can everyone hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, awesome. I do apologise if the question has already been raised before, just when I dropped out. But I was quite keen to see, when it comes in, the analysis of the sort of the apples for oranges, I guess, when you say you did the desktop review, just because I'm quite keen to, I think the biggest question I had in my mind was whether or not the existing amount itself is fit for purpose. And so I know you did quite a wide desktop review, but I'd be quite keen to see, I guess, more of a detailed look on councils that are probably similar in shape and portfolio and asset size as KCDC. So we're just checking, would that be coming in as part of the more detailed analysis?
Yes.
I have from staff, yes, that will be part of the more detailed analysis.
Oh, thank you. And I think the other one's more of a, just picking up on what Councillor Coe said around the, I guess, weighting for eligibility for not-for-profits versus profits. I get the point, but in my experience looking at funding, that somewhat becomes a bit moot because for-profits will just hide their application within a not-for-profit. So if that is an issue, we just need to kind of isolate it.
Cool. Point noted, Huri White. Thank you. Councillor Warwick.
I'm sorry I wasn't here. I had to go to, but I would have liked to be in here because there's two events that are quite big in Otaki. But my thing is around the accommodation, and I've talked to Neil Mackay about this as well. I think there's actually a lot of accommodation here. It's just enabling. There's a lot of rural properties who have and sleep out, spare kind of wings of their house and stuff like that. And if they were enabled and it was made easily that on these big weekends they could accommodate people, somehow with assistance from EDKB or staff or whatever, if that was a package that they could buy into, it would probably, there's a lot of accommodation around, I believe.
Thank you. When we come back on the policy, we won't lean into accommodation, but it is something that is on the radar. So a little bit of an assessment around Airbnb and the opportunity, I'm going to say at least for the short term, of leaning more into those opportunities to see how we can support those overnight stays is something that is on the radar that we will, in due course, come back to the table on.
Great. Councillor Halliday.
I'll just be brief. I just talking the accommodation thing. Went to Kimbolton a couple of years ago. Motor Home Association is a good group to liaise with as well. They had a field open at one of their fairs, and there was like a couple of hundred homes that stayed, and you had for extra $5. You had the option to stay overnight because they're all contained. But there's this very large moving contingent around this country that if you give them the understanding they can be there at a certain time, they'll converge as such. The other one was, and I think Bronte just highlighted it really, really well. When this was first touted, the ED strategy wasn't around, ED team wasn't around. So it's great to see that there's these synergies building between the two, because for me a big part of this is also we've got a tourism strategy and approach. So how does that tie into promoting these events and bringing these things together as well? Just want to make sure that that linkage is, I'm sure it is, but it's just articulating. It'd be good to make sure that that linkage is there, because things like Wellington on a Plate, you know, every time a Kapiti business goes into that, it usually sells out. So it's just a case of making more people aware of it or supporting them into actually doing it as such. You know, we've got to be careful we just don't reinvent the wheel, capitalise on the things that have already got a structure in place, and how do we make that work for us as well. The other thing is, I know when this was first touted, being involved in that conversation, and a big part of what this was about was preference being given to projects that were off-peak. In other words, things that were happening at winter, and that's Wellington on a Plate, to be honest. That's the whole reason behind Wellington on a Plate, was to create the business in the off-peak season as such. But that was one of the preference aspects of the Major Events Fund, was trying to nudge things into off-peak, because we've already got a packed calendar from November through to about, you know, mid-January, February sort of. We don't necessarily want more stuff there. We want it to actually be spread out during the year.
Yeah, thank you. My question relates to return on investment. So take, for example, the Kapiti Food Fair, and you've got a certain return of investment, say maybe 30%. Does that money go back to the council? So of all these grants we've given, when we talked about return of investment, is money returned to the council or not?
That's return on investment in terms of the economic return on investment. So it's money that goes into spending in the community and actually what is spent in the community.
So in other words, I don't know if that's a good use of the term return of investment, but I'm surprised that the money allocated to these groups, particularly Kapiti Food Fair, has been mentioned, profit group, and they're very, very successful. If we give them a grant, then that return of investment should go back to the council. And this reminds me of the Paraparaumu Community Board. The Paraparaumu Community Board, in their submissions to the long-term plan, recommended that abolishing the Economic Development Board. And I think there's merit in that, if none of this money is going back to the council.
I think I might note that obviously today we're talking about the review of the major events policy and effectively how we are setting criteria and I will say enabling business to scale up. That's the intention of the policy. And the policy helps to ensure that when a grant is confirmed or approved, that it lines up with the things that we are trying to achieve in the strategy. So the economic development strategy we've set and the destination management plan that we have in place underneath that, and that the purpose of this entire piece is to support business in Kapiti to thrive and to offer opportunities for people to live and work locally. So in terms of the return on investment, it's the return to the community rather than the return to council is how it's currently framed, just to clarify that point.
Darren, did you have something to add?
I just wanted to, in terms of, there was a comment in terms of feedback. It is very tough out there for major event organisers, and most of these events are very marginal. We know from previous feedback that we've had, if they didn't have sponsorship or support from council, they probably wouldn't move ahead with the events. And so there is a risk that if you do stop funding some events, they may not continue as well. Yeah.
I think that's a nice point to conclude this this briefing in a way, because I think from my perspective, I'll just make a couple of comments. One of the things with major events is it often hangs off one or two people who have a vision for it, and if they're not, let's take the pickle pot one that you already referenced, Councillor Wilson. It was two young people who had that vision. They moved on from the district. The thing fell over, and I think that's the challenge about the referencing of profit versus not-for-profit in this space, is if we want them sustainable and long-term, someone has to get paid to enable that to happen, because volunteer time on carrying a big events on and on and on without funding and support from council, whether it's not-for-profit or profit, that's a really hard tension, and I'm not sure there's a really clear answer to it. We've heard some expressions that we should only fund not-for-profits. Then Huruwai made a clear statement that a not-for-profit could be formed to hide the profit-making or paying of staff easy. So that becomes quite a challenging space to walk in. What I really like about this is that we're trying to listen to our events holders and listen to our community around how do we put the settings around this policy to the best so that we can get the kinds of events into our community that we need, that have a broad effect of encouraging this place to be a place that people come to, where they spend money, and where we have really, I think we've got some fantastic events that have been enabled through this policy. So well done to the staff on this review. I note that there are a couple of lights that have come on. I hope that they are questions related to this policy review and the topic?
Mine is just in terms of the criteria. Is there a scale in the criteria that prioritises Kapiti-run events? So, for instance, the Kapiti Classic is run by a Whanganui company, has no Kapiti bands, no Kapiti food, no Kapiti beverages. It just happens to be held here. So is there a? I'm not being necessarily critical of that. It is just what it is. I'm just suggesting that is there in the criteria a priority for Kapiti run events that have primarily Kapiti involvement, or is it just anybody who wants to have an event here?
Hello. It is not currently in the criteria. However, in the grant agreements, we do write in that they need to demonstrate how they will work with local businesses, including beverage and entertainment, like you've described, and the event being located in Kapiti means the economic activity and impact does occur in Kapiti. So, depending on where they're from, I guess isn't addressed in the current criteria.
If I may note, because that point is raised, I think we might follow up just to ensure that that criteria requiring linkage to local, I will say food and beverage and others, has occurred, because our intention would be for that return to our community that would need to happen. So we can come back and just confirm that, because I think that might have been a concern there. So we'll come back to you.
Great.
Can I
Councillor
make a-
Coe.
Yeah, I'll just make a very quick comment about not-for-profits. There seems to be some confusion about that term. So a not-for-profit doesn't mean just say someone doesn't make a surplus, and doesn't mean that everyone's a volunteer. So not-for-profits can pay people to do work. So an event organiser would get paid, yes, and some people can potentially make a job for themselves by setting up a charity, and they pay themselves within that charity. It just means that if there are surpluses, the surpluses go to the community, but also that there's a governing body around that is looking at things from the community perspective, as opposed to a business owner's perspective. So you just want to clarify that it does, charities do pay people, heaps of them do. Salvation Army, Nico Foundation, Red Cross, they do pay people, they run like businesses, but any surplus goes back to a charitable purpose, which would be our community. So that's, to me, that's a much more preferable model, I think. And if something is, as Darren said, relying on council support to stay viable when it should really be a business, then to me that's actually not a business. It's a not-for-profit if it's relying on council funding. It's not a sustainable business in its own right, and it should be structured as a not-for-profit to reflect that. It's quite simple as far as I'm concerned. I'm happy to talk to you about it more offline. Yeah, I mean, something's either sustainable or it isn't. If it's not sustainable, relies on external, grants and things, then should be a charity or some sort of not-for-profit type vehicle, and surpluses go for community purposes or some charitable purpose. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Councillor Coe, for clarifying that for us. All right, I think we're done. All the lights are off. Thank you to those who've attended online. Kim, Hurawai and Cam were here, and those in the room. Thank you. Thank you, staff. Bronte, Darren, Hamish. Oh, and Shelley. And Chris and Emily. Thank you. We've got lunch now. Got a next thing is this afternoon at 1:30. We've got a workshop, so we'll look forward to that.